Well, remember the pharynx, folks. We said that it is part of the digestive system, and we, at the time, we said it's also going to be mentioned in the respiratory system. So here it is. The pharynx is that tube found behind the nose, oral cavity, and the larynx. It's made out of the three portions: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. And more detail about this is found in the digestive system. It is a common pathway for food and air, and it helps in sound production. Now the larynx, and that is commonly known as the voice box, it is made out of lots of cartilages, membranes, and muscles, all lined with mucous membrane in order to produce sound. It is found anterior to the laryngopharynx. Okay, air has to pass through it in order for us to produce sound. And this is where, again, you will find the vocal cords. So let's introduce the cartilages that make up the larynx. There are three big cartilages that are single. There's only one of them. So the first one is the thyroid cartilage. And you can see it here made out of two thyroid plates, and they fuse in the middle to make this thyroid eminence. This is also, in males, that thyroid eminence is enlarged and is commonly known as Adam's apple. But again, we only have one thyroid cartilage. The second cartilage is known as the cricoid cartilage. It's found underneath or inferior to the thyroid cartilage. Anteriorly, it's much thinner, but if you look at a posterior view, you can see that the cricoid cartilage is much thicker. The third single cartilage is this tongue-looking one. It's known as the epiglottis. Now, there are three pairs of smaller cartilages. Those are, you'll find them, in order to find them, you want to take a look at the larynx from a posterior view. You'll find them on top of the cricoid cartilage. So there's the arytenoid cartilages, and on top you see those little corn-shaped cartilages. Those are known as the corniculate. And there are the cuneiform cartilages, which are not shown in this image because they are actually suspended by mucous membrane. And because these images aren't showing mucous membrane, they would be pretty much just hanging in thin air. Now here you can see a model that has the mucous membrane. This right here is the epiglottis. You could see how the mucous membrane makes these two different folds. These are known as the vocal cords, but these are not, well, one of them at least is not the vocal cords that we use for speech. So let's discuss the two different kinds of vocal cords that we have. There's the one on the top, and that's known as the false vocal cord. You see them on both sides. These are the upper folds. They are also known as the vestibular folds. Again, these are false. They have nothing to do with sound production. It's these larger lower ones. These are the true vocal cords on either side, and those are known as your vocal folds. And the opening between them, where air would have to pass in order for us to breathe and in order to produce different sounds, is known as the glottis. And now we can understand why this is called the epiglottis. Epi means above, so this is the cartilage above the glottis. And a glottis, again, is that space between the two lower vocal folds. Here you can see an image of a scope in the larynx, so a laryngoscope, and you can see the upper false vestibular folds and the lower true vocal folds. The space between them, again, is known as the glottis, and if you take a look down there, you can actually start seeing the trachea. So how is it that we produce sounds? Well, we move the vocal cords, okay, open and close them. And if we want to you want to think of it kind of like a whistling. If you want to produce a high-pitched sound, you are going to narrow the glottis. If you want to produce a lower-pitched sound, you will open up the glottis. You will separate the two vocal cords from each other. Now, underneath the larynx, as air passes through the larynx, it goes down the trachea. The trachea is commonly known as the windpipe. It is a tube that goes from the larynx, and then it starts to branch off in order for air to reach each of the lungs. It is found anterior to the esophagus, and as it reaches the thoracic cavity, it'll branch off into a right and a left primary bronchus. The trachea is lined with ciliated mucous membrane with goblet cells, which means, again, it is obviously going to make mucus since it is a mucous membrane. And the cilia helps in trapping any fine particles that we've inhaled and to prevent these fine particles from reaching the lungs. The cartilages that you see here that make the trachea are actually not ring-shaped. They're not a complete circle. They are C-shaped. So if we take a look at them from an upper view, you can see here that the C-shaped cartilage, and in the back, there is no cartilage. The two sides are connected through smooth muscle fibers. Okay, so again, you have these C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage, and here you can see the mucosa covering it. Well, let's imagine a scenario where the vocal cords have shut completely, and which means that this person can no longer breathe. Well, that is obviously an emergency where a tracheostomy can be performed, which is a cut or an incision in the trachea, and then an insertion of a tube in order for air to reach the lungs. So at this point, you're really underneath, you're inferior to the larynx, you're inferior to where that obstruction occurred, and the person will be able to breathe. The bronchial tree means that the trachea is going to start to divide and branch off until it reaches the air sacs. So here you have the trachea, the two primary bronchi, and then we'll talk about the branching as it keeps on going. Here you can see the kind of like a cast of the bronchial tree, where we have the trachea that divides into a right and a left primary bronchus. And then each primary bronchus is going to divide into a secondary bronchus. These secondary bronchi will go to one to each lobe of the lung. So for example, the right lung has 3 lobes. So the right primary bronchus will branch off into 3 secondary bronchi, known as lobar bronchi, because 1 for each lobe. And then the secondary bronchi further branch off into tertiary bronchi or segmental bronchi. Unfortunately, we do need to know these in order. Okay, so the trachea will keep on dividing until it reaches the microscopic alveoli. So again, we have the right and left primary bronchi, and then secondary and tertiary bronchi. From there, it goes into IT, or intralobular, and then terminal bronchioles, and then a respiratory bronchiole, and then the triple A's, the alveolar duct, alveolar sacs, and alveoli. Now, pretty much all, that respiratory pathway that we talked about, all of the branching of the different bronchi, there is no exchange of gas that happens, and these are pretty much just part of the conduction pathway, just because they transport air, and there's no exchange of gas that happen. It's not until it reaches the respiratory bronchioles, and as you can see here, the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar duct, the alveolar sac, which is that cavity there in the middle, surrounded by these little alveoli, that's where gas exchange is going to happen, and that's known as the respiratory pathway. So the rest of the pathway is pretty much just for conduction, and that's what it's actually known for, a conduction pathway, just to transport the air to the respiratory pathway where gas exchange actually occurs. Now for the structure of these respiratory tubes, remember we said that the trachea is made out of C-shaped cartilages and smooth muscles. Well, when it branches off to the primary bronchi, the cartilages are now a complete circle, okay? But the cartilages, the lumen starts to narrow. The amount of cartilage starts to decrease gradually as we branch off until the cartilage completely disappears in the bronchioles. The smooth muscles are going to diminish as well until it reaches the alveolar ducts where they totally disappear. And even the epithelial lining changes. So you'll find in the larger tubes, we have the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, kind of like the trachea. And then because the aim is exchange of gas, and these columnar epithelium are just too long for exchange of gas to happen. So the epithelial cell needs to start to shrink and get shorter. So it moves on to a simple cuboidal in the respiratory bronchioles. And then when we reach the alveoli, that's where it changes into a flat, simple squamous epithelium. And here you can see the alveolar sac, where with the simple squamous epithelial lining, these blue dots represent the nuclei. And you can see the blood flow coming from the right ventricle. It is oxygen poor or deoxygenated. And there's an exchange of gas that occurs here. This is your external respiration, where the blood picks up oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide. And then this blood is going to leave the lungs now as oxygenated blood and go all the way to the left atrium. Remember where it dumps that oxygenated blood in the left atrium with the 4 pulmonary veins. And I will see you in the next part.